When I moved into the apartment with Jake, I thought it was going to be great. We had been friends since sophomore year, so living together seemed like the natural next step. The first couple of weeks were normal, just two guys trying to adjust to adult life. We hung out, played video games, and talked about girls. Typical stuff. But there was something strange about Jake that I hadn't noticed before. He was incredibly private about his bedroom. He kept the door locked all the time. At first, I didn't think much of it. Everyone's entitled to their privacy, right? But as time went on, I began to feel like something was off. One night, after a few beers, I asked him why he kept his room locked. He laughed it off, saying he just liked his space and had some valuable stuff in there. I didn't push further, but curiosity started eating at me. What was he hiding in there? Then, things got weirder. I started noticing little changes in the apartment. I'd come home from work and find the kitchen rearranged, the living room furniture slightly moved, and once, my bed was unmade even though I always made it in the morning. It was subtle, but unsettling. I asked Jake about it, but he just shrugged, saying I must have done it and forgotten. I began to feel like I was being watched. I'd catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye, only to find nothing there when I turned my head. There were times I thought I heard someone breathing behind me, only to turn around to an empty room. My sleep started to suffer. I'd lie awake at night, straining to hear any sound, any sign that something was wrong. One evening, Jake went out for the night, leaving me alone in the apartment. I couldn't resist the urge anymore. I had to know what was behind that locked door. I rummaged through the kitchen drawer where we kept spare keys, but couldn't find any that matched. So, I did something I'm not proud of. I picked the lock. The door creaked open, revealing a room that was eerily ordinary. A bed, a desk, some posters on the wall. But then I saw it. The closet door was slightly ajar, and inside, there was a small safe. I knew I shouldn't, but my hands were already moving, trying combinations until one finally clicked. The safe opened, and what I found inside made my blood run cold. There were photos, dozens of them, of me. Some were taken in my room while I was sleeping, others while I was in the shower, and a few even while I was at work. But the most disturbing part was that they weren't all recent. Some of the photos were from years ago, before Jake and I had ever moved in together, even before we became friends. Underneath the photos was a journal, filled with pages of detailed notes about me, my habits, my schedule, my interactions with people. It was like I was being studied, analyzed. There were also lists of potential scenarios, all involving me getting hurt, or worse. I stumbled back, feeling sick to my stomach. My mind raced with questions. How long had Jake been planning this? What was he planning? Before I could process any of it, I heard the front door creak open. Panic surged through me as I quickly locked the safe and shoved it back into the closet. I closed the bedroom door behind me, heart pounding in my chest, and rushed back to the living room, trying to act normal. Jake walked in, his face as calm as ever. But now, every smile, every casual remark, seemed laced with something sinister. He asked how my night had been, and I forced a smile, trying to keep my voice steady as I answered. The whole time, I was terrified he could see right through me. That night, I didn't sleep. I couldn't. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering what the hell I had gotten myself into. The next morning, I packed up and moved out, giving Jake some excuse about needing to take care of family stuff. He didn't seem surprised. He just nodded, watching me with those calm, unreadable eyes. A few days later, I went to the police. They took my statement and promised to look into it. But as I walked out of the station, I felt a shiver down my spine. Jake was out there somewhere, watching, waiting. I'll never forget what the officer said to me as I left. People like that don't just stop. Be careful. To this day, I don't know what Jake was planning or how long he'd been planning it. But I do know one thing. You never really know someone until you've lived with them. During my junior year of college, I found myself in a pretty sweet living situation. I managed to score a spot in an off-campus house with only one other roommate, Alex. The rent was cheap, the neighborhood was quiet, and the commute to campus was easy. Alex was a year older than me, an engineering major, and pretty laid back. We didn't hang out much, but he was friendly enough, and we got along just fine. The house itself was old, with creaky wooden floors and a basement that always seemed damp no matter how many times we ran the dehumidifier. I wasn't a fan of the basement, and to be honest, I avoided it as much as possible. Alex, on the other hand, spent a lot of time down there, tinkering with his projects or whatever it was that engineers did in their free time. One evening, Alex knocked on my bedroom door, asking if I could help him move some boxes in the basement. He'd ordered a bunch of equipment for a project and needed an extra hand to get everything organized. I agreed, figuring it was no big deal. Besides, it would give me a chance to finally see what he'd been working on down there. When we got to the basement, I was surprised at how cluttered it had become. The space was filled with shelves of tools, parts, and random gadgets I couldn't even begin to identify. Alex led me to the far corner, where a large metal hatch was set into the floor. I hadn't noticed it before, but then again, I'd never really explored the basement thoroughly. "This is where I keep the heavy stuff," Alex said, crouching down to unlock the hatch. "Just need to get a few things out. Shouldn't take long." I watched as he lifted the hatch, revealing a steep set of stairs leading down into darkness. A cold draft wafted up from below, sending a shiver down my spine. "Mind grabbing that flashlight?" Alex asked, nodding toward a workbench nearby. I handed him the flashlight, and he motioned for me to follow him down the stairs. I hesitated, but curiosity got the better of me. I carefully descended the steps, the creak of the old wood echoing in the confined space. The room at the bottom was surprisingly large, and the walls were lined with concrete. It looked more like a bunker than a basement. There were more shelves down here, packed with boxes and crates, but what caught my eye was the far wall. It was covered with photographs and blueprints, all connected by strings of different colors, like something out of a conspiracy theorist's lair. I felt a chill as I recognized some of the photos, classmates, professors, even some people I knew from around town. They were all connected in a web of lines and notes scribbled in the margins. It didn't make any sense, and the more I looked, the more uneasy I felt. "What is all this?" I asked, my voice coming out weaker than I intended. Alex didn't answer right away. He was rummaging through a crate, pulling out various tools and setting them aside. Finally, he looked up, his face half lit by the flashlight's beam. "It's research," he said flatly. "Everyone has a pattern, you know. People think they're unpredictable, but they're not. You just have to look closely enough." I didn't know how to respond to that. The whole setup felt off, wrong, even. I took a step back, my mind racing as I tried to process what I was seeing. Why did Alex have all these pictures? What was he planning? Before I could ask, Alex stood up, holding something that looked like a modified piece of lab equipment. He turned it on, and a low hum filled the room. A red light flickered to life, casting an eerie glow over everything. "I've been working on this for months," Alex said, more to himself than to me. "It's almost ready." "Ready for what?" I asked, my voice tinged with nervousness. "For the test," he replied, his tone matter of fact. The way he said it sent a jolt of fear through me. This wasn't just some engineering project. This was something else, something dangerous. I needed to get out of there, but the stairs seemed so far away, and I wasn't sure what Alex would do if I tried to leave. I took another step back, trying to act casual. "You know, I just remembered I've got a paper due tomorrow. I should probably head back upstairs." Alex glanced at me, his eyes narrowing slightly. not interested in the experiment. Maybe later, I lied. I really need to get that paper done. For a moment, he just stared at me, and I could feel the tension in the air. Finally, he shrugged and turned back to his equipment. Suit yourself. I didn't wait for a second invitation. I climbed the stairs as quickly as I could without breaking into a run, and once I reached the top, I practically sprinted to my room. My hands were shaking as I grabbed my phone and called the police. I didn't know how to explain what I'd seen, but I knew something was very wrong. They arrived within minutes, and I led them to the basement, trying to keep my voice steady as I told them about the hatch and the room below. But when they opened the hatch, the stairs led down to nothing but a small, empty storage space. The photos, the blueprints, the equipment, everything was gone. The room I had just been in minutes ago didn't exist. The police looked at me like I was crazy, and I didn't blame them. They left after giving me a stern warning about wasting their time. I went back to my room, shaken and confused, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The next morning, Alex was gone. His room was completely empty, as if he had never lived there. I asked around, but no one seemed to remember him. My landlord, my classmates, even the professors he supposedly had classes with. It was like Alex had been erased from existence. And then I found the envelope under my door. Inside was a single photograph of me, standing in that underground room, with a note that read, "You passed the test." To this day, I still don't know what Alex was planning, or why he chose me as his subject. But I can't shake the feeling that he's still out there, watching, waiting for his next test to begin. The first red flag was the toothbrush. It was a small thing, really. Just a cheap, blue toothbrush sitting in the cup holder in our shared bathroom. But it wasn't mine. And I was pretty sure it wasn't Hannah's either. Hannah and I had been roommates since the start of the semester, and we'd gotten along well enough. She was quiet, kept to herself mostly, and spent a lot of time studying in the library. I didn't mind. It gave me space to enjoy the dorm room on my own. I knew her schedule almost as well as my own, so when I saw that toothbrush one morning, I knew something was off. Hannah was always neat, borderline obsessive, really. She kept everything in its place and never left a mess. If she had a new toothbrush, I'd have noticed. But I didn't think much of it at first, figuring maybe she had a guest over or something. I went about my day, chalking it up to nothing. A week passed, and I started noticing other little things that weren't mine and definitely weren't Hannah's. A hair clip on the floor, a half-drunk bottle of water on the desk, a textbook in a language neither of us spoke. I asked Hannah about it, and she brushed it off, saying I was being paranoid, that I was probably just forgetting things or misplacing them. But the feeling that something was wrong kept gnawing at me. Then, one night, I came back from a late study session and found the room locked. It was weird because Hannah never locked the door when she was inside. She knew I didn't take my keys with me. I knocked, and when she finally opened the door, she looked startled, almost scared. The lights were off, and the room smelled faintly of something burning. "What's going on?" I asked, trying to peer past her. "Nothing. Just couldn't sleep," she mumbled, avoiding my eyes. I didn't push it, but the tension between us grew. The atmosphere in the room became suffocating, like we were both tiptoeing around something unsaid. I started staying out late, finding excuses to be anywhere but in that room. I didn't want to admit it, but I was scared. Of what? I wasn't sure. One night, I decided to confront her. I couldn't take it anymore, the silence, the unease. I came back earlier than usual, hoping to catch her off guard. The door was slightly ajar, and as I pushed it open, I froze. Hannah was standing by her bed, holding a suitcase. She didn't notice me at first, so I stood there, watching. She was packing, but not just her things. She was packing some of mine too. Clothes, books, even that strange toothbrush. My heart pounded in my chest, and I stepped forward, my voice shaky. "Hannah, what are you doing?" She jumped, dropping a shirt she was folding. Her eyes were wide, like a deer caught in headlights. For a moment, we just stared at each other, the tension between us thick enough to cut with a knife. "Why are you packing my stuff?" I demanded. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she slumped onto the bed, burying her face in her hands. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry. I didn't want to, but I had to." "Had to what?" "What are you talking about?" She looked up, her eyes red and puffy. "I'm not Hannah." My blood ran cold. "What do you mean you're not Hannah?" She took a deep breath, as if steeling herself. "Hannah and we switched places. I'm not supposed to be here." I stared at her, my mind racing. This had to be some kind of joke, right? But the look in her eyes told me otherwise. "It started as a prank," she continued. "We thought it would be fun to swap places for a week. Hannah would go to my school, and I'd come here. But then, I didn't want to leave. I liked it here. I liked your room, your stuff, your life." My throat went dry. "Where's Hannah?" "She's fine. She's living my life now. But I can't keep this up. I can't keep pretending." I felt like the ground had shifted beneath me. This person, this stranger, had been living with me, pretending to be someone she wasn't. And I hadn't even noticed. "You need to leave," I said, my voice trembling. "You need to get out of here." She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I'm sorry. I'll go. I'm sorry." She grabbed her suitcase and walked out, leaving me standing there, my mind reeling. I didn't know what to do, who to call, or even how to process what had just happened. After she left, I tried to get in touch with the real Hannah, but all her social media accounts had been deleted. The university records showed she'd withdrawn from classes. It was like she'd never existed. I never saw either of them again. But sometimes, late at night, I lie awake wondering, who else in my life isn't who they say they are? When I first met Rachel, she seemed like the perfect roommate, clean, quiet, and always on time with rent. We connected through a mutual friend, and within a week, we signed a lease together. It was my first time living away from home, and I was excited to have some independence. Little did I know, that excitement would turn into a waking nightmare. From day one, Rachel was polite but distant. She kept to herself, often retreating to her room for hours at a time. At first, I chalked it up to her being introverted or just needing space after long days at work. But things started to feel off. I'd come home to find the furniture slightly moved, or a cabinet door left open when I was sure I'd closed it. It was subtle at first, easy to brush off as my own forgetfulness. But then, I noticed food missing from the fridge, my shampoo levels mysteriously dwindling, and even a few of my clothes misplaced. I confronted Rachel about it, but she just smiled faintly and said she had no idea what I was talking about. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was all in my head. But the feeling of unease kept growing, especially at night. I'd hear faint creaks and shuffling in the apartment, sounds I couldn't quite place. Sometimes, I'd wake up in the middle of the night, certain I'd heard the floorboards outside my bedroom door groaning under someone's weight. One evening, I came home earlier than usual and found Rachel in the living room, sitting on the couch with a strange expression on her face. Her eyes were wide, almost vacant, and she was holding something in her hands, one of my shirts. She was just staring at it. My heart pounded in my chest as I asked her what she was doing. She looked up at me slowly, her expression blank, and then she said, in a tone so casual it sent chills down my spine, "It smells like you." That night, I locked my bedroom door. Days turned into weeks, and Rachel's behavior grew more unsettling. She would stand in the hallway, just outside my room, not saying a word. When I'd ask if she needed something, she'd just stare at me, unblinking, before walking away without a sound. I started avoiding her as much as possible, spending more time out of the apartment and even considering breaking the lease. But I was trapped, financially and mentally. One night, I woke up to the sound of my door creaking open. My heart stopped. I had locked it, I was sure of it. But now, it was slowly swinging inward, revealing the pitch-black hallway beyond. I stayed frozen in my bed, too terrified to move, as Rachel stepped into the room, her silhouette barely visible in the dim light. She didn't say anything, just stood there, watching me. I could hear my own breathing, shallow and rapid, as she took a step closer, then another. My mind raced, trying to figure out what to do, but I was paralyzed with fear. She reached the edge of my bed, and for a moment, I thought she was going to. I don't know why. But then, she simply leaned down and whispered, "You shouldn't lock your door. It makes things harder." That was it. The next morning, I packed a bag, grabbed my essentials, and left. I didn't care about the lease, the rent, or anything else. I just needed to get out. I moved in with a friend that same day and never went back to the apartment. I left everything behind. It wasn't until a few weeks later that I got a call from the building manager. He asked if I knew where Rachel was. Confused, I told him I had no idea, that I had moved out. He then explained that the apartment had been found abandoned, with all my belongings still inside. Rachel was nowhere to be found. And then, the twist that still haunts me to this day, there was never any record of Rachel living there. The leasing office had no documents, no ID, nothing. The person I had been living with for months was a complete stranger, someone who had somehow slipped into my life, into my home, and then disappeared without a trace. I still wonder who she really was, what she wanted, and why she chose me. But most of all, I'm haunted by the thought that I could have been just one more missing person in a file somewhere, one more victim of a roommate I never really knew. I never thought I'd find myself standing outside the police station, heart pounding in my chest, staring at the man I once believed was my perfect partner. It all started innocently enough. We met at a mutual friend's dinner party, the kind where everyone is trying a bit too hard to impress. He was charming, attentive, and had this way of making you feel like you were the only person in the room. His name was Daniel, and from the moment we met, everything just clicked. We spent the next few months wrapped up in each other. It was the kind of relationship that felt almost too good to be true. We liked the same movies, shared the same dark sense of humor, and even had matching tastes in food. It felt like fate, as if I had finally found the person I was meant to be with. Daniel was perfect. Almost too perfect. At first, it was the little things that started to nag at me. He never talked about his past, like, at all. Whenever I'd bring up anything personal, he'd smoothly change the subject or make a joke to lighten the mood. It was odd, but I shrugged it off. After all, everyone has their secrets, right? Then came the controlling behavior. He didn't like it when I went out with my friends, insisting we spend every moment together. He would jokingly suggest that I didn't need anyone else but him. At first, I was flattered. Who wouldn't want to feel so desired? But over time, it became suffocating. One night, we were out for dinner at a cozy little bistro. The waiter, a guy I'd known for years, came over and started chatting with me. Nothing unusual, just friendly banter. But I could feel Daniel tense up beside me. The rest of the evening, he was cold, distant, barely speaking a word. When we got home, he exploded, accusing me of flirting with the waiter, saying that I was humiliating him. It was the first time I saw his temper, and it scared me. But I stayed. I don't know why. Maybe I was in denial, or maybe I just didn't want to believe that this man, who had been so wonderful, could have such a dark side. He apologized profusely the next day, showering me with gifts and attention. It was like the outburst had never happened. Except it did. And it wasn't the last time. Over the next few months, Daniel's behavior became increasingly erratic. He'd swing from being the most loving partner to someone I didn't even recognize. The jealousy grew worse. He'd accuse me of cheating if I so much as smiled at a stranger. He started showing up at my workplace unannounced, monitoring my every move, and demanding to know who I was with at all times. I felt trapped, suffocated by his love, if you could even call it that anymore. But the final straw came one night when I was going through some old boxes in the attic. I was looking for a photo album when I stumbled across a small, dusty box labeled with a name I didn't recognize. Curious, I opened it. Inside were dozens of letters, all written by different women. Love letters, to be exact, addressed to Daniel. Some were recent, others dated back years. Each one expressed undying love and devotion. But as I read through them, a chill ran down my spine. The words were eerily similar to the things Daniel had said to me, the same lines, the same promises. And then I found the photos. They were of Daniel with different women, all of them smiling, all of them looking at him like he was their whole world. But in every single picture, there was something off, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. That's when I found the police report. It was buried at the bottom of the box, a crumpled piece of paper with a mugshot of Daniel's face. Only, the name beneath it wasn't Daniel, it was a different name entirely. The report detailed charges of stalking, harassment, and restraining orders filed by several women. My heart raced as I realized the truth. Daniel, or whatever his real name was, had a history of manipulating and terrorizing women. And I was just the latest in a long line of victims. I knew I had to get out, but I had to be smart about it. I didn't want to trigger his wrath. So, I started making plans in secret, slowly distancing myself, telling him I was busy with work, avoiding his calls. But he noticed. The night I decided to leave, he showed up at my apartment, unannounced, with that same charming smile. But there was something in his eyes, something that made my blood run cold. He knew. Going somewhere, he asked, his voice calm, too calm. I lied, saying I was just visiting a friend, but he didn't believe me. He started accusing me of cheating again, saying I was leaving him for someone else. His voice grew louder, more menacing, until he was screaming at me, his face twisted with rage. In that moment, I knew I was in real danger. I grabbed my phone and ran into the bathroom, locking the door behind me. I called the police, my hands shaking so badly I could barely dial. He pounded on the door, yelling that if he couldn't have me, no one could. The police arrived just in time. They found him trying to break down the door, his face contorted in a way I'll never forget. They arrested him on the spot, and as they led him away, he kept screaming my name, promising that this wasn't over. I later learned that he had done this before, many times. He would charm his way into women's lives, become their perfect partner, and then slowly, methodically, tear them apart. I was just one of many. I still get chills thinking about how close I came to being another one of his victims, how easily I had been deceived by his charm. The man I thought was perfect turned out to be a monster, hiding in plain sight. And the worst part, he's still out there, somewhere. They released him on bail, and he disappeared without a trace. Sometimes, I catch myself looking over my shoulder, wondering if he's watching, waiting for the right moment to come back and finish what he started. They say love blinds you, but I never realized it could make you blind to the truth right before your eyes. When I met Sarah, she was everything I'd ever wanted, intelligent, ambitious, and full of life. We met at a conference, both of us caught in the crossfire of corporate networking. What started as professional admiration quickly turned into something more. We spent hours talking about our careers, our dreams, and our shared love for travel. After a few months of dating, I was head over heels. Sarah was the kind of person who made everything seem brighter, more exciting. She had this way of making you feel like you were the only person in the room, like your thoughts and opinions mattered more than anything. So when she suggested we move in together, it felt like the most natural next step. Things were perfect, or so I thought. Our lives blended seamlessly, and we supported each other's careers like a well-oiled machine. She knew how to lift me up after a bad day and celebrated every victory, big or small. It felt like we were building a future together, something solid and real. Then one day, out of nowhere, Sarah came home with the news that she had been offered a job in another city, an incredible opportunity that she couldn't turn down. But it required us to be in a long-distance relationship for a while. She insisted that it was temporary, that we'd make it work, and before I knew it, she was packing her bags. The first few months apart were tough, but we managed. We texted constantly, had video calls every night, and visited each other whenever we could. But slowly, something began to change. Sarah started becoming distant, her calls shorter, her texts less frequent. Whenever I asked about her new life, she'd give vague answers, brushing off my concerns with reassurances that she was just busy. Then one evening, I received a message from an unknown number. It was a video, and my heart dropped as I opened it. The video showed Sarah, laughing and talking with another man in what looked like an intimate dinner setting. They were holding hands, and at one point, he leaned in and kissed her. I was in shock. This couldn't be happening. There had to be some mistake. Desperate for answers, I called Sarah. She didn't pick up, and for the next few days, she avoided me completely. My mind raced with possibilities. Was she cheating on me? Was everything we had a lie? I couldn't stand the uncertainty, so I decided to take matters into my own hands. I took a weekend off and flew to the city where she was supposedly working. When I arrived, I tried calling her again, but she still didn't answer. So I went to her office, hoping to surprise her. When I got there, I was the one who was surprised. The receptionist gave me a confused look when I asked for Sarah, claiming she didn't work there. My stomach twisted as I insisted, giving more details about her supposed job. But the more I described, the more it became clear. The job, the office, everything she told me was a lie. Panicking, I decided to visit the apartment where she said she was living. I pounded on the door, but no one answered. I waited in the hallway, hoping to catch a glimpse of her, but hours passed with no sign of Sarah. Just when I was about to give up, the door finally opened. But it wasn't Sarah who stepped out, it was the man from the video. He looked startled to see me, but when I asked for Sarah, his expression turned cold. He told me that she wasn't there, that she'd left weeks ago without saying goodbye. I was stunned, speechless. This man, the stranger from the video, knew more about Sarah's whereabouts than I did. When I demanded to know what was going on, he just shook his head and closed the door in my face. In that moment, everything came crashing down. The woman I loved, the future we were building, it was all a carefully constructed lie. Sarah had been living a double life, stringing me along while she built a new life with someone else. The job offer, the move, the distance, it was all a cover for her to slip away, leaving me with nothing but unanswered questions and a broken heart. To this day, I have no idea where she is or why she did it. All I know is that the person I thought I knew, the woman I loved, was a complete stranger. And the worst part, I never saw it coming. It's been 3 years, but I still can't shake the feeling of dread whenever I think about that apartment. When I first moved to the city, I was desperate. The rent prices were astronomical, and I was scrambling to find something I could afford. So when I saw the listing for a 2-bedroom apartment in a decent neighborhood at half the usual cost, I jumped on it. The only catch was that I'd have to share it with someone. The ad was vague about the roommate, just saying he was a student who kept to himself. That didn't bother me. I wasn't looking for a best friend, just a place to live. When I arrived to check out the place, I was surprised by how nice it was. The building was old but well maintained, with tall ceilings and large windows that let in plenty of light. The landlord, a balding man in his late 50s, seemed pleasant enough as he showed me around. The roommate, he explained, was a quiet guy named Mark who spent most of his time in his room. He didn't seem to want to introduce us, which I found odd, but I was more focused on securing the place. I met Mark briefly that evening after I moved in. He was in the kitchen, making something on the stove. I remember he didn't look at me directly, just a quick nod before retreating back to his room, clutching his plate of food. I didn't think much of it. I was tired and just wanted to unpack. The first few weeks were uneventful. Mark kept to his word and stayed out of sight. I'd hear him sometimes, the muffled sound of his TV through the walls, or the creak of floorboards as he moved around. We'd cross paths occasionally. He'd be leaving the kitchen just as I was entering, or I'd catch a glimpse of him heading out the door. He was always quiet, his expression distant, like his mind was 1,000 miles away. One night, I came home late after a long day at work. As I approached the building, I noticed that our apartment's window was the only one lit up. The rest of the building was dark, and it struck me how eerie it looked. I shook off the feeling, blaming it on exhaustion. As I entered the apartment, something felt off. The air was thick, oppressive. The light in the hallway flickered, casting long, ominous shadows. Mark's door was slightly ajar, and for a moment, I thought I heard someone whispering. I paused, listening, but the sound stopped. Shrugging it off, I headed to my room, telling myself that I was just tired. Over the next few days, small things started to bother me. I'd find the front door unlocked in the morning, even though I was certain I'd locked it the night before. Objects in the living room would be moved. Nothing major, just little things like a book that had shifted an inch or a chair that wasn't quite where I'd left it. I rationalized it all. Mark was probably absent-minded, I told myself. But then there were the smells, pungent, unfamiliar odors that would waft through the apartment at odd times. Sometimes it was the sickly sweet scent of decaying flowers, other times it was something more metallic, like blood. I tried to bring it up with Mark, but whenever I knocked on his door, there was no response. I'd see him occasionally through the crack in his door, just sitting on his bed, staring blankly at the wall. The tension in the apartment grew. I started avoiding being there as much as possible, spending long hours at work or out with friends. But every time I returned, that feeling of unease hit me like a wave. I started to dread coming home, but I didn't have anywhere else to go. Then, one night, everything escalated. I was lying in bed, struggling to sleep. The silence of the apartment was thick, almost suffocating. And then, I heard it, a faint scratching sound, like nails on wood. I froze, straining to hear. It was coming from the hallway, just outside my door. I held my breath, my heart pounding in my chest. The scratching grew louder, more insistent, like something was trying to claw its way in. I reached for my phone, the only source of light in the dark room, and slowly got out of bed. My fingers trembled as I dialed 911, but I hesitated before pressing call. What was I going to say? That I was scared of a noise. They'd laugh me off the line. Instead, I grabbed a heavy book from my bedside table and slowly opened the door. The hallway was empty, but the scratching continued, louder now, almost frantic. It was coming from Mark's room. I approached his door, my hand trembling as I reached for the handle. It wasn't locked, and with a slight push, the door creaked open. Mark was standing in the middle of the room, his back to me. His hands were moving rapidly against the wall, scratching at it with his nails. The wallpaper was torn in long, jagged lines, exposing the wood beneath. I called out to him, my voice shaking, but he didn't respond. I stepped closer, my heart in my throat. As I reached out to touch his shoulder, he suddenly stopped and turned to face me. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, and filled with a wild, frantic fear. But what struck me most was his hands. His fingers were raw and bloody, the nails broken and torn. "Mark," I whispered, my voice barely audible. He didn't respond. Instead, he took a step back, his gaze never leaving mine. There was something in his eyes, something that made my blood run cold. It wasn't just fear, it was as if he was looking at something I couldn't see, something terrifying beyond comprehension. And then, without warning, he lunged at me. I barely had time to react, stumbling backward into the hallway. He was on me in an instant, his hands clawing at my face, his teeth bared in a feral snarl. I screamed, trying to push him off, but he was stronger than I expected, his strength fueled by whatever madness had taken hold of him. Somehow, I managed to shove him away, and he collapsed to the floor, panting heavily. His eyes were still wild, darting around the room as if searching for something. I didn't wait to see what he would do next. I ran. I didn't stop until I was outside, gasping for breath in the cold night air. My heart was pounding, my mind racing with questions. What the hell had just happened? What was wrong with Mark? I called the police, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone. When they arrived, I explained what had happened as best as I could, but they looked at me like I was crazy. Still, they agreed to check the apartment. I waited outside, watching as they entered the building. The minutes dragged on, each one stretching into an eternity. Finally, the officers returned, their expressions grim. They had found Mark in his room, sitting on his bed, staring blankly at the wall. He didn't resist when they took him away. He just kept mumbling something under his breath, something about them being in the walls. They told me he was taken to a psychiatric facility for evaluation. I didn't go back to the apartment. I couldn't. I packed up what little I could carry and stayed with a friend until I found a new place. But even after I left, the nightmares persisted. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, the sound of Mark's frantic scratching echoing in my mind. It was a few weeks later that I learned the truth. A detective handling the case contacted me. He said they had been looking into Mark's background and had found something disturbing. Mark had a history of mental illness, something the landlord had failed to disclose. But that wasn't the worst of it. The apartment we had been living in had a dark history. Years before, a man had been found dead there, his body hidden behind the walls for months before it was discovered. The man had been renting the apartment with a roommate who had also gone missing around the same time. The police suspected foul play but never found enough evidence to charge anyone. The case had gone cold, and the apartment had eventually been rented out again. But according to the detective, there had been other incidents since then, other tenants who had reported strange sounds, unexplained events, and an overwhelming sense of dread while living there. None of them had stayed long. I realized then that Mark's madness had been triggered by something in that apartment. Whether it was the history, the isolation, or something else entirely, I didn't know. But whatever it was, it had pushed him over the edge. I couldn't stop thinking about what he had said, about them being in the walls. I shuddered at the memory of his wild eyes, the way he had clawed at the wallpaper as if trying to free something trapped behind it. To this day, I can't explain what happened in that apartment. I've tried to forget, to move on, but the memories still haunt me. The nightmares come less frequently now, but when they do, they leave me trembling, drenched in sweat. And every time I close my eyes, I see Mark's face, twisted in fear and madness, his bloody hands reaching out, scratching at the walls. I've heard that the apartment is still vacant. The landlord has tried to rent it out a few times, but no one stays for long. They all leave, just like I did, too scared to stay another night. Sometimes I wonder if Mark was right, if there really was something in the walls. Something that drove him to madness, that tried to reach out and grab hold of me too. But I'll never know. And maybe that's for the best. Because whatever it was, I never want to face it again. Years later, I was browsing the internet late at night, trying to distract myself from the lingering memories of that apartment, when I stumbled upon a forum dedicated to urban legends and unsolved mysteries. One thread in particular caught my eye, a discussion about a notorious apartment in my old neighborhood, known for driving its occupants to madness. I hesitated for a moment, my heart racing as I clicked on the thread. As I read through the posts, my blood ran cold. Several people claimed to have lived there, all recounting eerily similar experiences, unexplained noises, strange smells, and an overwhelming sense of being watched. But it was one post, in particular, that made my heart stop. It was from a woman who had lived in the apartment just a few years before I did. She described how her roommate had become increasingly paranoid, convinced that there were people living in the walls, watching them. He had started scratching at the walls, desperate to find a way out. Just like Mark. Her post ended abruptly, with a chilling detail that sent a shiver down my spine. She wrote that after her roommate had been taken away, she had stayed behind to pack up her things. And as she was leaving, she had noticed something strange, small holes in the walls, just large enough for someone to peer through from the other side. She had moved out that same day, but she couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching them the entire time. I slammed my laptop shut, my hands shaking. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The room seemed to close in around me, the walls suddenly too close, too oppressive. Had there been someone else in that apartment with us? Someone hidden, watching, waiting. I'll never know for sure. But one thing is certain, I'll never go back to that place. And if you ever come across an apartment with a history of strange occurrences, with stories of tenants driven to madness, do yourself a favor. Stay far, far away. Because some things are better left unseen. I never thought I'd discover something truly horrifying while packing my boyfriend's things, but that's exactly what happened. Jason and I decided to move in together. We were both excited, dreaming of the perfect little apartment where we could finally build our lives together. The only problem was that Jason had a ton of stuff in his old apartment that needed to be packed up and brought to our new place. I volunteered to help out, eager to get everything sorted so we could start fresh. One rainy afternoon, I found myself alone in Jason's dimly lit old apartment. The sound of raindrops pattering against the window created a soothing backdrop as I began sorting through his belongings. The apartment had a musty smell, and the furniture seemed to sag with age. But it was the closet in the bedroom that caught my eye. The closet was a mess, boxes stacked haphazardly, clothes hanging on wire hangers, and a general sense of chaos. As I started to sift through the mess, I noticed a small, dusty box tucked away in the back. Curious, I pulled it out and wiped off the layer of grime. The box was old, made of dark wood with ornate brass clasps. My fingers trembled slightly as I opened it, revealing an assortment of old photographs, letters, and trinkets. I was intrigued, but it was one photograph that stopped me cold. The photo showed a group of people, Jason included, at what looked like a party. Nothing strange there, but in the background, partially obscured, was a woman I didn't recognize. She wasn't just any woman. She had a hauntingly vacant expression, her eyes unnervingly hollow. I tried to shake off the discomfort I felt, attributing it to the dim lighting in my tired eyes. But the image stuck with me. I continued going through the box, but the photo was all I could think about. Later that evening, when Jason came over, I couldn't hold back my curiosity. I showed him the picture, and he grew visibly tense. "Oh, that's an old friend of mine, Sarah," Jason said, trying to sound casual. She moved away a while ago." I asked more about Sarah, but Jason's answers were vague. He changed the subject quickly, which only fueled my unease. Something about the way he avoided eye contact and shifted the conversation made me uneasy. I decided to do some research on Sarah, but I couldn't find any online trace of her. It was as if she had vanished. The following week, things began to get strange. I started receiving anonymous text messages on my phone, each one with a single line, "I'm watching you." At first, I thought it was a prank, maybe even a misguided joke. But the messages persisted, growing more frequent and more threatening. One evening, I was home alone when I heard a knock on the door. When I opened it, there was a package waiting for me. Inside was a collection of old photographs and letters, all of which included Sarah. My heart pounded as I scanned the contents. It became clear that someone was obsessively watching our lives, documenting every detail. Jason was increasingly erratic, and his defensiveness about Sarah grew worse. He dismissed my fears as paranoia and insisted I was overreacting. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. One night, I found myself unable to sleep. I decided to go through the rest of Jason's old belongings, hoping to find something, anything, that would explain the mounting dread. That's when I stumbled upon a hidden compartment in one of the boxes. Inside was a journal. The entries were unsettling, describing Sarah in disturbing detail. They spoke of an intense and dangerous obsession, and the last few entries were chillingly about me. Jason had been involved in something dark, something that extended beyond mere friendship. It became clear that Sarah was not just a past acquaintance, but someone who had been dangerously obsessed with him. The journal revealed that she had been watching us for months, and the messages I had been receiving were from her. The final entry was the most terrifying. It read, "If I can't have him, no one will. You've been warned." When Jason came home that night, I confronted him with the journal. His face went pale as he realized that his past had caught up with him. He confessed that Sarah had become dangerously obsessed with him and had stalked him for years. The anonymous texts and photos were her way of tormenting us. Jason assured me that Sarah was no longer a threat, but her sudden disappearance and the ongoing threats left us shaken. We took every precaution to protect ourselves, but the lingering fear and the haunting memories never left us. It was supposed to be the trip of a lifetime, 2 weeks in Europe with the man I thought I would marry. But it turned out to be the most heartbreaking experience of my life. Alex and I had been together for 3 years. He was the kind of guy who made everyone around him feel at ease. Charming, witty, and thoughtful, he knew exactly how to make me feel special. We'd been planning our European getaway for months, meticulously mapping out each city we would visit. I couldn't have been more excited. The first few days were perfect. We explored the romantic streets of Paris, the bustling markets of Barcelona, and the historic sites of Rome. But as we continued our journey, something about Alex began to change. It was subtle at first, a lingering gaze, an offhand comment that didn't sit right. But I brushed it off, thinking he was just tired from all the travel. It wasn't until we arrived in Vienna that things took a dark turn. We had a reservation at a quaint bed and breakfast on the outskirts of the city. It was picturesque, with ivy-covered walls and a small garden. The owner, an elderly woman, welcomed us warmly and showed us to our room. But from the moment we stepped inside, I felt uneasy. The room was small and old-fashioned, with a single window overlooking the garden. The wallpaper was peeling, and the furniture seemed to creak with age. Alex seemed unfazed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That night, I barely slept. The next morning, I woke up to find Alex gone. His side of the bed was cold, and there was no sign of him in the room. Panic set in as I searched the entire bed and breakfast, but he was nowhere to be found. I rushed to the owner, hoping she had seen him. She looked at me with a puzzled expression. "Your husband checked out early this morning," she said in broken English. My heart dropped. "What do you mean?" We're supposed to be here for 3 more days. The owner nodded slowly, as if realizing something wasn't right. He said there was an emergency and he had to leave. He took the train to the airport. I couldn't believe it. Alex had just left. Without telling me. Without even leaving a note. I frantically tried to reach him, but his phone went straight to voicemail. I checked our travel plans, hoping for some clue, but everything seemed normal until I found the return ticket. My ticket was for a flight back home in 3 days, as planned. But Alex's ticket was for a different flight. A flight that left that very morning. My hands trembled as I realized he had planned this. I called the airline, hoping there had been a mistake. But there wasn't. Alex was already on his way back home, leaving me stranded in a foreign country. Desperation set in. I had no idea why he would do this, why he would abandon me so suddenly and without explanation. My mind raced with possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. Was he in trouble? Was this some kind of cruel joke? But as I tried to piece together what had happened, a far more disturbing possibility came to mind. I remembered the odd moments during our trip, the times he'd gone off on his own, the hushed phone calls he'd made when he thought I wasn't listening. Had Alex been planning this all along? The idea that I had been nothing more than a pawn in some twisted game made my stomach turn. I couldn't bear the thought that the man I loved had deceived me so thoroughly, had left me alone and vulnerable in a place where I knew no one and didn't speak the language. Over the next few days, I struggled to find a way home. I maxed out my credit cards, using what little cash I had left to pay for food and a cheap hotel room. The bed and breakfast owner was kind enough to let me stay for an extra night without charge, but she couldn't do more. The sense of isolation was overwhelming. When I finally made it back home, I was met with the final, devastating blow. Alex had vanished. His apartment was empty, his phone disconnected. There was no trace of him anywhere, no friends, no family, no social media presence. It was as if he had never existed. The police were no help. They told me it was likely a case of someone deciding to disappear, to start over. But that explanation didn't satisfy me. I couldn't accept that the man I'd spent 3 years with had just walked away without a word. Months passed, and the questions continued to haunt me. Why did he leave? Was our entire relationship a lie? What was he running from, or towards? To this day, I don't know the answers. I've tried to move on, to rebuild my life, but the memory of that trip still lingers. The man I thought I knew, the man I loved, vanished into thin air, leaving me with nothing but doubts and annoying fear that I'll never truly understand what happened. And every time I book a flight, I can't help but wonder if I'll be the one left behind again, stranded and alone, with no one to turn to. As a parent, you always want what's best for your child. When my daughter, Lily, started acting out in school, I knew something had to be done. Lily was only in 2nd grade, but her teacher, Mrs. Hammond, had already sent home several notes about her disruptive behavior. It didn't make sense. Lily was a sweet, well-behaved girl at home. But the notes kept coming, and soon, Mrs. Hammond requested a parent-teacher conference. I remember walking into the school that afternoon, feeling a mix of frustration and worry. The school was eerily quiet, with most of the students gone for the day. Mrs. Hammond's classroom was at the end of a long hallway, and as I approached, I could hear her speaking in a low, soothing voice. I assumed she was talking to Lily, preparing her for our meeting. When I entered the room, I was surprised to find it empty, except for Mrs. Hammond. She was sitting at her desk, a strange, almost forced smile on her face. "Where's Lily?" I asked, glancing around the room. "She's in the library with another teacher," Mrs. Hammond replied, her smile never faltering. "I wanted to speak with you alone first." I nodded, feeling a bit uneasy. There was something off about her demeanor, too calm, too controlled. but I pushed the thought aside, focusing on the reason I was there. I'm concerned about Lily, I began. She's never had issues like this before. At home, she's completely different, happy, polite. I don't understand what's happening here. Mrs. Hammond leaned forward, her smile fading slightly. I've been observing Lily closely, and I think she's struggling with some emotional issues. It's not uncommon at this age, especially when a child feels misunderstood. Her choice of words struck me as odd. Misunderstood? What do you mean? Mrs. Hammond sighed, her gaze locking onto mine with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. Lily's been talking about some unsettling things. Things that suggest she might be going through something difficult at home. I felt a chill run down my spine. What are you saying? We have a normal, happy home. She's not going through anything. Mrs. Hammond's expression softened, but there was still a strange edge to her voice. Sometimes, children express their emotions in ways that aren't immediately obvious. I think it would be helpful for Lily to spend more time here after school. We could work on some activities to help her express herself. The suggestion didn't sit well with me. What kind of activities? Mrs. Hammond smiled again, but this time, it felt more like a smirk. Just some simple exercises to help her feel more comfortable. Trust me, I've done this before with other students, and it's been very effective. I stared at her, trying to read her intentions, but her face was a mask. Something about the way she was talking about my daughter, the way she was almost insistent on keeping her after school, made my skin crawl. I appreciate your concern, but I think we'll stick with our routine for now, I said, standing up. I'll talk to Lily, and if we feel she needs more help, we'll consider other options. Mrs. Hammond's smile faltered, just for a moment, before she quickly regained her composure. Of course. Just know that my door is always open. I nodded, eager to leave the room. As I walked out of the classroom, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I turned back, just in time to see Mrs. Hammond's smile drop completely, replaced by a cool, calculating stare. That night, I sat down with Lily and gently asked her about school, about Mrs. Hammond. She hesitated at first, but then she said something that sent a shiver down my spine. Mrs. Hammond says I should tell her everything, Lily whispered, her eyes wide. She says I can trust her, and that I shouldn't tell you because you won't understand. I felt my stomach turn. What do you mean, sweetie? What does she want you to tell her? Lily looked down at her hands, fidgeting nervously. She asks me about our house, about you and Daddy. She wants to know if you ever get mad, or if you ever make me feel scared. But you don't, Mommy. You're not scary. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to stay calm. Lily, you can always tell me anything, okay? You don't have to keep secrets from me. What else has she said to you? Lily looked up at me, her eyes full of confusion. She says she can help me feel better, but I don't feel bad. I like being at home with you. But sometimes, when I'm at school, I feel weird. Like I'm not myself. I hugged her tightly, trying to reassure her while my mind raced with worry. I didn't know what Mrs. Hammond was trying to do, but I knew one thing for sure. My daughter wasn't going back to that classroom. The next morning, I called the school and requested an immediate transfer for Lily to another teacher. The principal agreed, but as I was leaving the office, Mrs. Hammond appeared in the hallway. She didn't say a word, but the look she gave me, a look of pure, unfiltered rage, made my blood run cold. We never saw Mrs. Hammond again after that. Lily's new teacher was kind and supportive, and my daughter slowly returned to her cheerful self. But every now and then, Lily would mention something that Mrs. Hammond had said or done, little comments that hinted at something much darker lurking beneath her friendly exterior. I don't know what Mrs. Hammond was trying to achieve, but I'm certain of one thing. She was trying to manipulate my daughter, to twist her mind for reasons I can't even begin to understand. And I'll never forget the look in her eyes that last time I saw her, when she realized she had lost. To this day, I wonder how many other children she tried to help. How many other parents didn't see the warning signs in time. I'll never know, but I'm just glad I trusted my instincts and got Lily away from her before it was too late.